Eifel Highlands, Germany. January 7, 1945. Snow fell in dense, muffled sheets, turning the world into a white chamber where sound arrived late and left early. Only the distant, delayed rumble of artillery reminded me the war was still moving somewhere beyond the ridge. I was inside a half-collapsed concrete bunker, knees in slush, back against a wall that leaked cold through my coat. A dying private lay in my lap, his breath rising in thin clouds that hung in the bitter air before vanishing. The smell of burning supply crates seeped in from outside, wet smoke, scorched wood, and something metallic that clung to my tongue. A rusted nail jutted from the bunker wall beside me. Hanging from it was the last empty blood bag. Around me lay 15 wounded men, some conscious, some not, faces pale, limbs trembling under blankets that had long since lost their warmth. Their eyes moved the way trapped animals look for exits that aren't there. I kept pressure on the private's chest wound, feeling the weakening pulse through my frozen fingers. And the same question kept pressing at the back of my skull, heavier than the snow piling on the bunker roof. How did I end up here, alone, without supplies, surrounded by men who were minutes from death? Northern Eifel, just above the Ardennes. January 1945. We were a fragment, not a unit. What was left of a platoon from the 28th Infantry, pushed too far forward during the tail end of the German counterattack. Officially, according to the map in Battalion HQ, we were part of a neat blocking position anchoring the northern sector. On the ground, we were 15 wounded men and 1 medic in a cracked piece of concrete nobody remembered building. The hills around us were a maze of fir trees and frozen cuts in the earth. The Ardennes lay to the south, already famous for confusion and bad decisions. Up here in the Eifel, it was the same story, just with fewer witnesses. Roads twisted, disappeared under snow, reappeared as churned mud under blown-out trucks. The front line moved a mile one way, half a mile back, all inside the time it took a shell to travel from one ridge to another. Somewhere behind us, in a warmer room with electric light, there was doctrine. I had read it. Memorized it, once. No blood, no transfusion. Use only authorized intravenous solutions. That was the rule. The clean rule. The kind of sentence typed on a Remington and approved by men who had time to think in full paragraphs. Authorized solutions meant glass bottles with printed labels, plasma, saline, glucose. All of them listed in the manual, all of them accounted for in ledgers with tidy columns. On paper, they arrived by truck, by jeep, by sled if needed. On paper, every aid station had enough. In our bunker, the only thing that arrived regularly was cold air. The last plasma bottle had gone into a boy from Kansas the night before. He died 10 minutes later. The saline and glucose had followed, dripped into veins that were too empty to carry anything. The last authorized anything was that blood bag now hanging limp on its nail like a skinned animal. Command maps showed blue arrows, red arrows, firm lines of advance and withdrawal. Reality was a litter of bandages, a pile of empty morphine syrettes, and a floor slick with the things no one had planned for. The radio had gone silent at dusk the previous day, one short burst of static and then nothing. I changed batteries, checked the plug, listened to the dead hiss for an hour. The last message we'd received was a promise. Evacuation column en route. Hold. Stabilize casualties. Conserve supplies. Stabilize, conserve, hold. 3 words that didn't belong in the bunker I was sitting in. The wounded around me were not textbook cases. They were shattered femurs, shredded arteries, bellies full of shrapnel. Men who had bled through their bandages twice already, breathing in short, wet gasps. Their bodies needed red cells to carry oxygen. All I had left, by the book, was flavored water. I remember staring at the empty crates stamped with quartermaster codes and thinking how orderly they looked, even broken open. Wooden frames with numbers burnt into the sides. Serial. Tracked. Accounted for. The men on the floor were not. I had treated shock the way I'd been taught, keep them warm, elevate the legs, start a line if possible. In lectures, they told us that volume was life, that replacing lost fluid bought time until real blood could arrive. No one ever mentioned what to do when the until never came. Snow drifted in through a crack near the ceiling, melting on the stove that burned scraps of crate wood. The air inside the bunker was a strange mix, too warm in front of the fire, knife cold against the stone. Condensation glazed the concrete. Every breath turned to fog. That's when it became clear to me in a way I hadn't let myself admit before. The system could not keep up with the war. The manuals, the procedures, the slogans about standardized care, they all assumed trucks that arrived on time and roads that stayed roads. They were written for a front that moved like a parade, not like a landslide. Out here, in this corner of the Eiffel, the system had already ended. It just hadn't sent a memo. Before the war, I lived in a place where winters were quieter and the only thing that bled was a stubborn coffee machine. Lima, Ohio, flat land, low ceilings of cloud, and the steady hum of small-town routine. I worked in a pharmacy on West High Street, a place that smelled of antiseptic, mint tablets, and the burnt coffee breath of the old percolator by the back counter. My job wasn't grand. I mixed compounds, sorted vials, filed insurance slips no one read. But I liked the stillness. The order. The way chemicals behaved if you understood them well enough. My mother used to lean on the kitchen doorframe, arms folded, watching me tinker with jars and droppers I'd salvaged from the pharmacy's trash. "Lucas," she'd say, not unkindly, "you're always mixing something. One day it'll get you in trouble." I'd answer the same way every time: if I'm mixing something, it's because someone needs it. It wasn't bravado. Just truth. I never cared much for rules as long as the math was sound. The pharmacist, Mr. Kincaid, let me repair the things no one else wanted to touch: the temperamental coffee pot, the sticking drawer on the narcotics cabinet, the failing refrigeration unit that held insulin vials. He'd watch with a kind of tired amazement as I worked with a screwdriver and a length of wire like a man rewinding a clock. "You think different, Holt," he once said, wiping his glasses. "Not smarter. Just sideways." Sideways thinking didn't mean much in Ohio. But it kept machines running, and sometimes it kept people alive. Even then, I knew body chemistry like others knew hymn verses. Hemoglobin curves, osmotic pressure, what a cell needed and what it couldn't survive without. None of it was heroic. It was just the quiet work of noticing. When war came, I didn't rush to enlist. But I didn't hesitate either. Men were leaving, families were packing, and the radio carried a constant litany of places I'd never heard of but somehow needed tending. I signed as a medic because it made sense. A man should use his hands for what he understands. Training was orderly enough: charts, drills, lectures about regulated care. They taught us to follow procedure with the same reverence men gave scripture. The manual, the instructor said, exists because someone already made the mistakes for you. I believed that, for a while. In those early months, nothing suggested I'd one day sit in a frozen bunker mixing chemicals in a mess tin. Nothing implied that the rules I memorized in a warm classroom would feel like relics on a battlefield. But I remember one moment during training that should have warned me. A sergeant demonstrated how to apply combat tourniquets. He repeated the same sentence 3 times, as if chiseling it into our skulls: "Do not improvise. Improvisation K*LLS. I felt something then, not disagreement, exactly, but a quiet question stirring behind the ribs. Because the world I knew, the world of small-town machines and patchwork solutions, didn't care for absolutes. Sometimes improvisation was the only thing that kept the lights on. Still, I kept the doubt to myself. War had a way of making men obedient. Before deployment, my mother pressed a small tin into my hand. Inside were 6 bandages, a spool of thread, and a handwritten note I never showed anyone. "You fix what others break. That is who you are. Come home whole." I carried that tin in my pack through France, Luxembourg, and into the freezing teeth of the Eiffel. It grew dented, scraped, darkened by smoke. But I kept it anyway. A reminder of the person I had been, before the cold, before the wounded piled at my feet, before the day the rules stopped matching the world around me. Back then, I thought of myself as a quiet man with steady hands. I didn't yet understand that someday, those hands would mix something the manuals had no name for. By the 3rd day cut off, the bunker stopped feeling like a shelter and started feeling like a bad equation: too many variables, not enough constants. Snowfall had buried the trench line outside. The path down to the road was just a hollow in the drifts where men had dragged themselves in. That morning I took inventory again, though I already knew the answer. 2 bottles of saline, 1 mostly empty. Half a bottle of glucose. No plasma. No blood. 15 wounded. In training they'd taught us the language for it: hypovolemia, hemorrhagic shock, decompensation. On the floor it was simpler. Men were turning gray. Fingers and lips blue. Their pulses thready, slipping away no matter how many blankets I piled on or how often I whispered, "Easy now, you're all right," knowing it wasn't true. I found myself talking to the glass bottles like they were people who'd let me down. "Saline is just water," I muttered, more to the concrete than to anyone else. "It doesn't carry oxygen. We're only delaying death." A shape shifted near the entrance. Sergeant Malloy, broad shoulders, bandaged thigh, cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, raised an eyebrow. "You a professor now, Holt?" he grunted. "If there's no blood, there's no other option. That's what they told us." He said it the way men repeat scripture they no longer believe but are afraid to question. A few of the less wounded boys chuckled weakly when they saw me start digging through the supply pile again. I wasn't looking for bandages or morphine this time. I pushed those aside, going for the crates nobody had bothered to open because the labels weren't in the manual. Things scavenged from abandoned aid stations, from a cavalry unit that had pulled back in a hurry and left their veterinary kit behind. To them it must have looked ridiculous, the medic on his knees in the half-dark, hauling out brown bottles, rubber hosing, dusty metal tins stamped with unfamiliar codes. One kid from Alabama snorted. "Hey, Doc, you gonna start treating us like horses now?" "Maybe they'll run faster," someone else replied. I let the jokes roll over me. My hands were moving almost on their own, sorting, reading faded labels through grime. Albumin powder. Glucose concentrate. Coagulant, anticoagulant. A small tin marked in German, probably from some captured stash. None of it was sanctioned for what I was thinking. The manual in my pack might as well have been a prayer book in a language no one spoke anymore. Every page assumed a line of resupply trucks, a chain of command, an evacuation route. It assumed someone, somewhere, would come. I looked at the men instead. Corporal Jensen, belly wound, pulse like a trapped bird in his wrist. Private Morales, both legs gone above the knee, skin waxy, eyes dull. Malloy himself, pretending his soaked bandage wasn't leaking through again. They weren't dying because medicine didn't know what to do. We had known for decades what they needed: volume, oxygen carrying capacity, time. They were dying because all the tools to deliver those things were sitting in warehouses 50 miles away, while here we had wooden crates, fragments of chemistry, and rules written for another war. I'd spent my life around systems, pharmacy shelves, dosage charts, carefully measured combinations. Systems only worked if the inputs actually arrived. Here, the inputs were snow, shrapnel, and silence. I laid the scavenged materials out on a mess tin like parts from a broken clock. The others lost interest quickly and went back to their blankets, their cigarettes, their quiet staring. It was easier, I suppose, to trust the idea that nothing more could be done. But once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Men weren't dying because they were beyond saving. They were dying because no one had built them a bridge between no blood available and too late. I had chemicals that could hold fluid in the vessels. Proteins that could help keep pressure. A veterinary hemoglobin concentrate meant for animals, but hemoglobin just the same. I knew the pathways in theory, the risks on paper. What I didn't have was permission. Outside, artillery thumped somewhere far off, muffled by snow and distance. Inside, the only sound was the slow drip of melted frost from a crack in the ceiling, hitting the floor in a steady, indifferent rhythm. Plink. 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 Somewhere between those drops, a line was quietly moving inside me, away from the man who followed the manual, towards someone else entirely. The contradiction had taken shape. The book said no. The bodies on the floor said find a way. And I understood, with a calm that felt almost like betrayal. The tools existed. The men existed. The only thing standing between them now was a rule. The barrage started just after dark, the way bad news usually does. We heard the first German G*N long before the shell arrived, distant, hollow, a single cough somewhere beyond the tree line. Then the air in the bunker changed, a subtle tightening, as if even the cold was holding its breath. The round landed short, somewhere up on the slope. The concrete shuddered. Dust sifted from the ceiling in a slow gray curtain, settling on bandages and helmets and open mouths. A second shell followed. Closer. The stove rattled on its bricks. Counter-battery? Malloy asked. I listened. No reply G*NS. Just the next incoming whistle, sharper this time, like a knife through cloth. Doesn't sound like ours, I said. Then the real storm came. Heavy pieces, probably 105s, maybe a few 150s, began to walk the ridge line, searching. Each impact felt less like a sound and more like a hand slamming the bunker from above. Men grabbed at their helmets out of habit, as if thin steel would matter against tons of earth and concrete shifting overhead. Someone near the entrance screamed as a blast wave punched through the doorway, carrying snow, splinters, and the stink of fresh explosive. Two bodies tumbled inside, one dragging the other. Both left a dark trail across the threshold. I was moving before the dust settled. The first was conscious, barely, shrapnel through his shoulder and neck, arterial bleeding pulsing in bright, timed bursts. The second had taken a fragment low in the groin. Pelvic hit. The floor beneath him was already slick. "Lay them here," I said, though the men had nowhere else to put them. While I packed gauze into the neck wound, another shell hit so close the bunker seemed to lift and drop. A support beam cracked. Someone shouted that the roof was going. Someone else vomited from the concussion. By the time my ears stopped ringing, there were 3 more casualties, 2 dragged, 1 crawling, leaving a red smear where his knees should have been. All of them had one thing in common: they were leaking faster than my hands could keep up. The manual had a sequence for this. Stabilize. Record. Mark status. Prepare for evacuation. I could see the page in my head, black ink on white paper, neat bullet points. Our radio sat on an ammo crate, mute. Its last message, hours earlier, had been a brief attempt at reassurance. Roads congested but passable. Evac column delayed. Hold positions. Await further instructions. Now, under the drumbeat of German artillery, that sentence felt like something written in another decade. Lucas. Malloy barked over the noise. Triage. Who do we keep? He wanted me to choose. I looked around the bunker. Frost on the walls. Steam rising from torn uniforms. Men propped against the concrete like discarded mannequins, each with a different hole, a different chance. 15 before. Now 18. Maybe 19, one body near the door hadn't moved since they brought him in. If I followed the book, I would tag them: immediate, delayed, expectant. Focus on the ones with good airways, controllable bleeding, stable pulses. But the problem now wasn't which man to save. The problem was that every category ended the same way without blood. Outside, another shell tore up the slope. Snow and soil slammed against the bunker wall like a wave hitting a seawall. The lamp swung on its wire, casting the room in a slow, nauseating circle of light and shadow. I forced my hands to be steady. Tourniquet. Pressure dressing. Morphine. The routine motions we used to hold death at arm's length. Yet every time I checked a pulse after I'd done all I could, I felt the same thing, the slow, slipping rhythm of a heart trying to pump nothing. "Evac's not getting through tonight," one of the boys whispered. I didn't know which. The voices blurred. He was right. Even if the column was moving, no driver would thread a line of trucks through this barrage. No pilot would put a slow air ambulance over this grid square in the dark. The official answer was clear: stay put, conserve resources, do what you can, wait for daylight. I taped another dressing in place with fingers that no longer felt like mine and realized something simple, brutal, and undeniable. Doing things by the book now meant lining these men up in order and watching them die with correct paperwork. A shell hit close enough to snuff the lamp for a moment. In the brief darkness, the bunker was just breath and moaning and the faint glow of embers from the stove. When the light stuttered back, I saw the mess tin and the scattered bottles where I'd left them. Not enough blood. No plasma. No path in the manual. But we still had veins. And somewhere in the chaos of that evening, with German steel plowing the hillside and the radio dead and the rules curled like useless paper in my pack, a quiet line inside me moved past its last limit. If help wasn't coming, then the next move was mine. I don't remember deciding, not in the way officers talk about decisions. There was no speech, no moment of revelation. Just a series of small movements that, when strung together, crossed the line. I cleared a space on the floor beside the stove and set a dented metal mess pot down. The rim was blackened from soup and coffee and whatever else it had survived. Tonight it would hold something no one had named yet. My hands shook from the cold and from what I was about to do. I told myself the shaking was only from the cold. First, volume. I filled the pot halfway with boiled water from the kettle, hot enough to steam, not hot enough to scald. Into that, I mixed a concentrated glucose solution from the last intact bottle, watching the clear liquid thicken slightly as it swirled. Fuel for cells. Energy the body could still use if I bought it time. Next, pressure. I took the jar of dried albumin powder, meant to be reconstituted as a plasma expander, and tapped a careful amount into the pot. The powder clumped, then dissolved, turning the mix cloudy. Albumin would hold fluid inside the vessels, keep it from leaking out into the tissues. In theory. The men watched from their blankets with the dull curiosity of the exhausted. "You cooking us something, Doc?" someone called. "Something like that," I said. Then the part that would have earned me a court-martial even on a quiet day, the veterinary kit. A brown glass bottle with a worn label in English and French, hemoglobin concentrate for horses. I had found it 2 days before in an abandoned stable, along with a coil of rubber tubing and a saddle that still smelled of sweat. Hemoglobin is hemoglobin, I told myself. Iron-bound pigment that carries oxygen. The molecule doesn't care about uniforms. I unstoppered the bottle. The smell that rose up was familiar and wrong at the same time: iron, preservatives, a chemical sweetness underneath. I poured a measured amount into the pot. The clear, cloudy solution shifted, deepened, took on a murky red that caught the lamplight like watered wine. For a moment, the bunker was very quiet. I added packets of anticoagulant from an old transfusion set, white crystals that vanished as soon as they touched the warm mixture. Without it, whatever I put into a vein might clot solid before it reached the heart. Finally, I uncapped a small vial of iodine and a swallow of medical alcohol. Not enough to poison, just enough to change the structure of things a little, to keep organisms from blooming in this improvised bloodstream before it ever saw a vessel. The smell that came off the pot was sharp and metallic, like a backroom pharmacy and a slaughterhouse layered together. Behind me, Malloy exhaled slowly. "You know what happens if this goes bad, Holt?" "Yes," I said. He didn't mean the man on the floor. He meant charges, hearings, words like negligence and unauthorized procedure. I knew those too. I set the pot on a folded blanket to keep it from cooling too fast, then reached for the cleanest rubber tubing we had left. I rigged a crude drip, mess pot elevated on an ammo crate, tubing running through a clamp I'd scavenged from a broken stand, a filter improvised from layered gauze and a scrap of fine mesh taken from a gas mask canister. It was ugly, but it held. The first candidate lay closest to me, a kid from Pennsylvania, maybe 19, with *King chest wound and a pulse I could barely catch at the wrist. His tags read, Miller, J. He stared at the ceiling with the blank look of someone already halfway gone. According to doctrine, he was expectant. Not worth the resources. I slid the needle into the largest vein I could find in his forearm. His skin was cold and waxy. The flash of dark blood in the hub was slow, reluctant. I opened the clamp one notch. The red-brown liquid began its slow descent through the line. For a second, every voice in my training screamed at me to stop. This wasn't on any chart. This mixture hadn't been cleared by any board. If there was a wrong molecule in the wrong place, if a precipitate formed unseen, if his kidneys or lungs locked up. If I was wrong, I was not just losing a patient. I was *ling him. My throat felt dry. My hands hovered over the clamp, ready to shut it at the first sign of disaster. "God," I whispered, so quietly I wasn't sure if I'd said it aloud, "help me get away with this." Drop by drop, my unauthorized solution entered the boy's vein. The first minute was the longest of my life. I watched his face, not the drip. Training again, airway, breathing, circulation. His respirations were shallow, fast. Skin the color of old wax. I kept 2 fingers on his carotid, feeling for any change in the frantic, uneven beat hammering against my touch. Nothing, at first. Just the steady tick of drops sliding down the tube, the distant thud of artillery still working the ridge, and the small, ugly voice in my head listing everything that could go wrong. Air embolism. Anaphylaxis. Renal failure. Pulmonary collapse. At the 2-minute mark, his eyelids fluttered once. Could have been nothing. Could have been wishful thinking. I didn't let myself decide which. "Talk to me, Miller," I said, keeping my voice level. "You're at a field hospital. You're fine." A lie, but a familiar one. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His pulse was still faint, still racing in that fast, desperate way a heart has when it's trying to move more than it has. At 4 minutes, I thought I saw his color shift, just a fraction. Less gray, more human. It might have been the lamp, the way it swung on its wire. I forced myself not to believe it yet. Malloy knelt on the other side, watching my hands instead of the boy's face. "Anything?" he asked. "Too early," I said. "For him. For me." At 6 minutes, something changed. His pulse didn't get stronger exactly. It got cleaner. Less erratic. The wild stuttering eased into a more regular rhythm. Still fast, but coordinated. The kind of tachycardia you expect in shock, not the disorganized scramble of a heart about to fail. His breathing followed a moment later. The shallow, panting gasps deepened by a hair, then another. I watched his chest rise and fall. The air still rattled in the left lung, but the intervals between breaths lengthened. He wasn't snatching at each one like a drowning man anymore. "Lucas," Malloy said quietly, "you seeing this?" I see it, I answered. At 8 minutes, the kid's fingers twitched. His lips parted and he s**ked in a longer breath that ended in a weak cough. A line of pink foamed at the corner of his mouth, but when I wiped it away, more didn't follow. The lamp hummed. The stove popped. Somewhere outside, the barrage began to drift away, the G***ns searching for someone else to bother. At 10 minutes, his eyes opened. Not wide, just a narrow crack, pupils sluggish in the lamplight. But they focused. They tracked. They found me. Where? His voice was raw, torn by cold and blood loss. Am I? In a bunker, I said. Still with us. He swallowed. His throat worked slowly, like the muscles were remembering how. I thought, he started, then let it go. His heart was still hammering under my fingers, but it was a hammer driving straight now, not swinging wild. Behind me, someone whispered, "Holy God." Sergeant Malloy didn't cross himself. He wasn't that kind. He just stared at the mess pot, the tubing, the improvised filter, then back at Miller's face. "Holy hell," he breathed. "Holt, it works." I didn't answer immediately. One case isn't proof. One man waking up isn't a study. For all I knew, I'd bought him an hour and crippled him for the rest of his life. But I couldn't ignore what my hands were feeling. "I don't know what it is yet," I said. "But it's doing something." That was when fate, or coincidence, or whatever you want to call that numb intelligence running through the war, pushed the situation sideways. The barrage had fallen away to a distant echo when we heard boots on the steps. Not American. The rhythm was wrong. Shorter strides, different cadence. We *P***ns were raised before the first helmet appeared in the doorway. 3 figures stepped into the bunker, coated in snow, rifles half-shouldered. German field gray. For a second, no one moved. The war shrank to the space between us, 3 of them, almost 20 of us, most barely able to stand. No one was in shape for a proper fight. If they opened up, it would just be slaughter. The lead man's eyes swept the room, wounded on the floor, bandages, blood, my jury-rigged transfusion hanging from its ammo crate like a science experiment gone wrong. He sniffed once, sharply. Not at the smoke. At the smell. Slowly, he lowered his rifle. "Blutersatz," he muttered in accented English. "Blood substitute." He stepped closer to the pot, to the tubing, to Miller's arm. His hands were bare despite the cold, the calluses on his fingers stained with the same brown and red that coated mine. "Sanitat?" I asked. "Medic?" He nodded once. "This," he said quietly, eyes on the line, "could work." Then he reached into his bag and, without another word, laid out what I didn't have: clean needles. Better tubing. Actual filters. American and German, enemies in uniform, knelt on the same frozen floor. And together, under a crumbling roof in the Eifel, we started saving whoever we could reach. By dawn, the bunker looked less like a shelter and more like a place that had survived a long argument with death. The stove glowed faintly, barely pushing back the cold. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, iodine, sweat, and the strange warm iron scent of my improvised mixture. The snow outside had piled high against the doorway, muting the world to a muffled hush. I was on my knees beside the last patient, threading a fresh line with fingers that no longer felt attached to me. Across from me knelt the German medic, his name was either Weber or Webern, I never caught it clearly through his accent. He handed me the filter gauze the way a man passes tools in a workshop, quick, wordless, efficient. His breath made small clouds in the freezing air. We had already treated 9 men, Americans first, then his 2 companions, both hit by shrapnel on their way through the forest. Neutrality meant nothing now. Blood was blood, shock was shock. The body didn't check uniforms before deciding whether to live. The last patient was Malloy. He tried to wave me off, muttering, "Save it for the kids," but he'd lost too much blood through the night. The bandage at his thigh was soaked through, the edges stiff with cold. His lips had turned the pale lavender I'd come to dread. "You're getting it," I told him. "Damn fool," he whispered, but he didn't push my hands away. I opened the clamp. The deep red mixture slid into him, drop by drop. His jaw tightened once, then eased. The medic across from me studied Malloy's pulse with a professionalism that ignored sides. "This is not plasma," he murmured. "No," I said. "Not whole blood." "No." He nodded slowly. "But it carries oxygen. That's the idea." He gave a small sound, half a hum, half an exhale. Approval, disbelief, maybe both. Behind us, the other wounded lay bundled in blankets and coats, their breath steady in uneven rhythms. Some slept. Some stared at the ceiling, too exhausted to speak. A few, those closest to the edge hours earlier, had regained enough strength to whisper to one another. They watched Weber and me with the slack-jawed focus of men who no longer had enough energy to be surprised. At the 12-minute mark, Malloy opened his eyes. "You look like hell," he rasped. "You're welcome," I answered. Weber sat back against the wall, studying the mess pot as though it were a relic. "This will have consequences," he said quietly. "I know. No one will believe it. I know that too." He considered me for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a scrap of cloth, white linen, torn from a shirt. He folded it once and set it by the pot. A small gesture. A silent signature. Outside, the snow light brightened. Dawn breaking through the storm. We heard engines first, low, steady, American. A half-track and 2 jeeps. The blockade had finally lifted. Snow crunched under boots, voices shouted, and then a captain stepped into the bunker, stopping short when he saw the scene, Germans and Americans mixed, wounded breathing, me and Weber crouched over Malloy with tubing still running. His eyes moved from the men to the pot to the improvised lines. He didn't draw his sidearm. That was the first mercy. "Medic Holt," he said flatly. "Yes, sir." "Explain." I didn't have an explanation that fit inside regulation. Not one that belonged on a form. So I just said, I did what I had to do. He crouched, checked a pulse, lifted a bandage corner, studied a face that should have been dead but wasn't. His jaw tightened. "You saved them," he said. "It's not approved protocol," I replied. "No," he said quietly. "It never will be. And none of this is going into the report." I nodded. That was expected. He rose. "But these men are alive. That's what matters." Weber stood too, hands raised slightly, unsure of his fate. The captain glanced at him. "He helped?" he asked me. "Yes, sir. Couldn't have done it without him." The captain hesitated only a second. "Have him disarmed and escorted back through the line." "Alive." 2 soldiers moved to take the German medic, not roughly. Weber met my eyes once, gave the smallest nod a man can give without moving his head, and disappeared into the morning glare. When the captain left, the bunker exhaled. Men sagged back. A few cried quietly. Most just stared at nothing. I sat against the wall, exhausted to the marrow, my uniform stiff with dried blood, mine, theirs, the mixture, everything blurred. The pot rested on the floor beside me, still half full. Steam rose from it in thin, ghostly curls. 8 men saved outright. 2 stabilized. 1, Miller, sitting upright now, dazed but alive. What I had made shouldn't have worked. But it had. By the time reinforcements cleared the slope and declared the ridge secured, I could barely stand. A corporal tried to help me up, but my legs buckled, and he caught me under the arms like a man handling fragile cargo. My vision tunneled at the edges, black, then gray, then black again. They carried me out of the bunker the way you carry a man who might still be useful if he doesn't fall apart. The cold outside hit like a wall, sharp, unforgiving, honest. After hours breathing stew-thick bunker air, it felt almost clean. Snow crunched under boots. Engines idled somewhere down the slope. Voices overlapped, orders, questions, the clipped syllables of officers trying to impose structure on a scene that resisted it. Someone draped a blanket over my shoulders. Someone else shoved a canteen at my chest. I tried to drink but spilled half of it down my coat. A medical officer finally pushed through the tangle of bodies and knelt in front of me. Major Dorsey, square jaw, gloves too clean, eyes that measured everything as if the numbers could save him from surprise. "You're Holt," he said. "Yes, sir." He studied my face, then the blood spattered across my sleeves. Some of it was bright, some dried to a brown crust. A few flecks were the wrong color entirely, red with a violet sheen, the residue of my improvised mixture drying on my skin. "What happened in there?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was hiding anything, I just didn't know where to begin. There was no page in the manual labeled when everything collapses but people still need to live. Instead, I handed him my notes. They were barely legible, pencil scrawl on damp paper, lines smudged by sweat, blood, and shaking hands. Ratios, observations, pulses recorded minute by minute, adjustments made on instinct sharpened by necessity. At the bottom of one page, I'd written a phrase without realizing it. Not blood. Just time. The major flipped through the pages slowly. His face didn't change, but something in his posture did. His shoulders stiffened, jaw tightening the way a man does when he finds something he wishes he hadn't. You administered this mixture intravenously? He asked. Yes, sir. To how many? 11, I said. 8 needed the full dose. 3 got partial. And the Germans? 1 medic. 2 wounded. You treated them? Yes, sir. He let out a breath, a long, measured exhale that made a thin cloud in the cold air. You realize none of this is authorized. I nodded. I know. And you realize the consequences. I do. He closed the notebook but didn't hand it back. Instead he rested it on his knee. How many of the men survived because of this? He asked quietly. 9, for certain. The others, we'll see. He looked past me at the stretcher line. Men who had been pale shadows hours earlier now had enough strength to lift their heads, answer questions, breathe without gasping. Miller sat propped against a snowbank, a medic checking his vitals. Malloy was smoking a cigarette someone had lit for him, exhaling through clenched teeth. Major Dorsey wasn't a sentimental man. I don't think he believed in miracles. But he believed in results, and the results were leaning against trees and drinking broth from tin cups. He shut the notebook. We can't put this in any report, he said. Not officially. I understand. But the battalion surgeons will want to see this. Quietly. I said nothing. The world felt too loud, too bright, the snow throwing back more light than my eyes could bear. The major lowered his voice. Holt, you may have kept a platoon alive last night. Possibly more if this reaches other aid stations. I felt an odd emptiness at that. Not pride, not fear, just a kind of quiet fatigue, like the war had reached inside me and taken whatever reaction there was supposed to be. He signaled to the orderlies. Get him on a litter. He's done enough standing. As they lifted me, the captain from earlier approached, boots crunching through refrozen snow. He carried something rolled in his hand, a white linen scrap. Weber's cloth. He held it out. This was left in the bunker, he said. I took it. The fabric was stiff with dried blood. German blood. American blood. My mixture. No borders left. The captain added, whatever you did last night, it won't be documented. Command won't touch it. But every medic in the sector has already heard. I closed my eyes, exhausted beyond words. Somewhere behind us, a truck engine rumbled to life. Stretcher teams loaded the wounded. The war moved on, indifferent as always. Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, 3 aid stations were already trying to copy my method before the sun finished rising. The litter shifted as they carried me toward the jeep line. Snowflakes drifted across my face, melting instantly. For the first time in hours, no one was dying. That would change again soon. But not because of what happened in the bunker. Not today. Back in Ohio, the war felt like something that had happened to another man. I returned to the same pharmacy on West High Street, the same ceiling fan that clicked on every third rotation, the same shelves of powders and pills arranged in quiet rows. Customers came and went. I filled prescriptions, repaired the refrigerator twice, and pretended the world was simple again. The box of field notes stayed under my bed, creased, stained, never opened. No one asked about the mixture. No officers visited. No letters arrived. The men who lived because of it scattered across the country, carrying futures they were never supposed to have. Decades later, long after my hands had steadied into old age, a military archivist knocked on my door. He held a smudged page between 2 gloved fingers. Emergency oxygen carrying substitute, L. Holt, he read. At the bottom, in my own faded pencil. Not blood. Just time.